Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 230 and I am the show's host, Kyle. On today's show, I'm going to be talking about Rand Paul's trip to Russia and generally how Congress has reacted to Donald Trump and his foreign policy, because I think this is something very important. And I also want to talk quite a bit about Saudi Arabia's diplomatic dispute they have pretty much started and provoked with Canada, and tie that into what's going on in the war in Yemen. So again, as I say every time, for those of you who could share the show, it really does help out the show. So foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, or just check out the libertarianinstitute.org. Right there on the homepage, you can find my daily news roundup and the show and share the show from there. Also give some extra love to the Libertarian Institute as, the Institute's director, Scott Horton, the famous @ScottHorton show on Twitter, has been suspended from the website. So, as much as Twitter is crap and obviously their policies are deeply flawed, if Scott Horton is, being the one getting suspended from Twitter, the most anti-war, let's not kill a human being person on the planet, but it is, I'm sure, going to hurt some of the shares and stuff for the site because a lot of people retweet the stuff on Twitter. So think about going actually to the Libertarian Institute and make sure you're putting that stuff, out there on Twitter to make up for a little bit of a vacuum now. All right, so let's get into the news for today. Rand Paul goes to Russia, and he's not the first congressman to go to Russia. I think you go back, Dana Rohrabacher went to Russia and he took some heat for it as well. And that's pretty much been the reaction from the mainstream media. I think more jokingly, you get the accusations that Rand Paul is some kind of Kremlin agent. Although when Rand Paul was opposing the Senate resolution to bring Montenegro into NATO, and Rand Paul was opposing it, saying that, the having the mutual defense pact between the United States and Montenegro simply isn't worth it, and that, Russia isn't really an offensive threat and all this stuff. John McCain called him a puppet of Vladimir Putin on the Senate floor. So there are at times the real accusations, and then there's more of the satirical stuff. So the bigger point is, though, is that you have a senator going to Russia to look to, find places to make peace, to improve relations between the two countries, and instead mocked and ridiculed and never praised or never, given a fair platform. You hear very few people ask Rand Paul, well, what are some things that Russia and the U.S., that the Russian diplomats or politicians think the United States and Russia could work together on, to make the world a better place? And I'm sure Rand Paul could then say, they want to discuss, nuclear arms reductions, or possibly restarting the anti-ballistic missile treaty, looking at capping nuclear weapons, or getting rid of nuclear weapons on these cruise missiles and stuff like that. All these very positive steps that could help to reduce nuclear tensions between the United States and Russia. And while the nuclear threat may not seem all that serious, it is important to remember that the way the radars and the sensors are set up, that if, somebody busts into Donald Trump's bedroom in the middle of the night and says, Mr. President, you have, this amount of time to decide whether this is an actual nuclear strike, or, maybe a malfunction with the equipment, or some other way that this, isn't the strike it's alleged to be in. Andrew Cockburn talks about this a lot on an episode of the Scott Horton show. So I'll link to that for those of you who want a lot of information there. But the point is that, while those tensions might not be there all the time, there are, nuclear weapons at the ready at all times. And, it only takes the president, of one of the two world powers really to say, all right, let's go. And, the policy is if you don't use them, you lose them. So if they believe the nukes are coming over, they can't wait and see if it blows up a U.S. city, because one, the targets will, I'm sure, be the U.S. missile silos, assuming that it was a real attack. So you would have to assume that if you don't decide to use your nuclear weapons, then the enemy is going to target them, and that puts you in a position where you better fire them before they hit and land. But on a much smaller scale, the United States and Russia could work together in various areas of Africa where they either have competing or similar interests. In some cases, Syria is a case where the United States and Russia should have similar interests. It's worth noting that, Russia is not a friend of the Sunni jihadist radicals. And in fact, ISIS has targeted Russia with terrorist attacks, and there is a kind of separatist population in southern Russia that really, is Muslim, and at times kind of the Sunni jihad style Muslim, that are resistant to central rule in Moscow. And so not that I necessarily want the United States to start helping Russia oppress their own people. When we're looking at battlefields like Syria, there's certainly room for if the U.S. is going to be bombing in Syria and Russia is going to be bombing in Syria, those two countries could certainly work together to make sure they're targeting the ISIS-style jihadists rather than waging two separate wars, oftentimes, trying to let, especially on the American side, I know this happened, the way they're letting ISIS retreat is, kind of beneficial to our YPG allies and is intended to hurt the Assad government and not necessarily just focusing all of our attention on the Islamic State group. So, there's these positive steps. Also, as you're looking at what's going on in the Middle East, I mean, this is in much more of Russia's neighborhood than the United States. And so when you look at Iraq needing millions, if not billions of dollars to rebuild, same thing with Syria now. And then, of course, you have like kind of the Israel-Palestine issue and just all the places around the Middle East where the kind of the way the international community works now, there is going to be these outside superpowers providing aid. Why not work with the Russians to productively implement this aid rather than just, doing it, I want to say separately, but that's not, I don't think, a super accurate description because there, I'm guessing, would be some, USA given to groups that are, in opposition to Russian rule or Russian-backed governments. And so it's a little bit in opposition to, while we're still both building and not bombing each other, we're doing it in opposite directions. That's not the most helpful thing to the people on the ground. And that should be the important thing to remember here is that, the people who live in the Middle East are real people with real lives. They only get one of them just like us. They enjoy things just like us. They're miserable just like us. And so if we're going to, go to all these places and have all this influence around the world, we should really, actually be trying to make positive steps and not just projecting the United States empire's goals in order to enrich the people at home, at the expense of everybody else's lives. So Rand Paul had, made this trip, and all applause to Rand Paul for that. At times on this show, I have been critical of Rand. I do have a soft spot for him because, his father is the, man that really helped open my eyes to these views and helped me to understand that, the American military isn't the, force for good that it claims it is. So, for that, I always like to watch what Rand's doing and support him when he's doing something, well and right. And sometimes when he's messing up, I try, maybe look at the possible silver lining to it or whatever. But in this case, it is truly a great thing. He has invited some Russian lawmakers and I'm guessing some diplomats to the United States. And of course, people are pretending like this is Rand Paul about to, either get duped by the Russians into having a Red Dawn or being, a secret Russian agent, having a Red Dawn moment where he's going to invite all these Russians to the United States and they're going to parachute out of our passenger planes and take over the country. Even though if every single Russian left Russia to do that, I really don't know if they could really take over the United States even in that case. But let's set that aside and just remember that these people are going to come and talk to the United States and hopefully, explain to U.S. lawmakers what the actual interests of Russians are. And I'm going to suppose that there's a lot of U.S. congressmen that really don't understand U.S. The foreign policy outlook of the world very well and just kind of take the partisan line of, you hate Trump because you're part of the resistance and you're part of the Democrat Party. And one of the things you do to illegitimize his presidency is say that he was put there by Putin. And, that maybe they could explain, hey, look, this obviously isn't the case. Everybody thought Hillary Clinton was going to win on election night. Why would we have tried to, upset the incoming president of the United States? And they could talk about how, hey guys, we hate ISIS too. And, we sure wish you would help us kill them. So, those are the, I think, potential positives coming from all of this. And again, good job, Rand. Now, another article I want to talk about, I think it was published in Roll Call, but was an interesting kind of summary of all the steps Congress has now taken to constrain Trump's foreign policy. The article definitely is kind of pro-Congress taking these actions, although I don't agree, but I think it's important to review them and see how terrible Congress's foreign policy is even worse than Donald Trump's foreign policy. And no, that's not an endorsement of the president. It's just saying that even though Donald Trump is really, really bad, people are still worse. One of the things that they have opposed with Donald Trump is Trump's less than favorable statements towards NATO. It's not like Trump has withdrawn from NATO, or I don't think in any way like seriously considered taking the steps to doing that, but has mused about it a little bit, and that's enough to get everybody in an uproar, saying that he's going to upend the kind of world order and make Europe a target for Russian expansion, which is obviously, can't possibly be the case. But Congress has gone on to pass resolutions, kind of affirming America's commitment to NATO. My guess, and this may be just giving Trump too much credit, and he may just be a flip-flopper, and sometimes he's right on NATO, and sometimes he's wrong, is that Trump, by saying, the NATO thing isn't working out, maybe, we should do something different, is because of the countries aren't spending their minimum 2% GDP that they're supposed to, according to NATO. Now, I don't want all these other countries spending money on weapons. However, I guess, from just the point of an American, we are subsidizing the military of a lot of these countries. If they really believe that there's a threat from their neighbor or Russia or whoever else, knowing that you have, the full force of America's military behind you certainly is going to help you feel more secure and, not be spending whatever percent of GDP you think you need to combat that threat. And so again, not that I think that, Lithuania has a massive outside threat to their country. At the same time, if they do believe that America is really subsidizing their military with ours. And so that, that's why Trump is making this big stink. And I'm sure there's a lot of weapons makers, lobbyists that are in the ears of his aides, and his aides are telling them that, hey, this is going to be good for American jobs because these countries will buy weapons, and guess who makes the weapons? We do. The other thing Congress has done is made it harder for Trump to withdraw sanctions on countries. This, I think was mainly targeted at Russia, and it's really, really disappointing, this legislation. If Donald Trump looks at the situation with Russia and says, hey, if we could relieve some sanctions here, it could really help to improve relations, then the president should be able to do that. And Congress shouldn't be passing legislation distinctly meant to keep the president from repealing these sanctions. I mean, imagine talking about this at this time 2 years ago, so August of 2016. And the problem being is that everybody thinks that Trump isn't a red-blooded, diehard American. Do you really think that Donald Trump would ever relieve sanctions on Russia to help Russia get the better end of America? Come on, this is absolutely ridiculous, and people only believe it because Trump is an idiot and, in a lot of ways, a very terrible person. And so, I think in a lot of ways there's some cognitive dissonance that went on with the left, and there's a lot of, this is the last hope in the way, they're delegitimizing the Trump presidency, and they're, trying to, kind of explain away how this didn't really happen, and, they're scared of what's going to happen under Trump. I think it's a lot like, the right-wing reaction from a lot of people with the whole, Obama birther stuff. It's that Obama's birth certificate was the last hope a lot of these people had to keep Obama from becoming president, and they had heard for months on end that had Obama taken the presidency, he was gonna, give the country away to the terrorists. He was gonna ruin the economy. He was gonna raise taxes to like 70%. And, there was a lot of hyperbole. And it turns out that the Republicans do the same thing as the Democrats anyways. But, this was the last chance. And I think it's less about believing that Obama wasn't Kenyan and more about holding on to that, that last hope that this man really isn't going to be president of the United States. Now, I think the Russiagate stuff has been infinitely worse just because who cares if Kenya has, made a secret president of the United States? Nobody is, the weapons industry, the lobbyists, and the Congress can't sell that Kenya is a threat to the American people. However, Russia, was who we fought the Cold War against. And, there's a lot of bad guys in a lot of American movies that I watched growing up where Russia was the bad guys. And so, it's very believable that Russia is a real enemy and that Russia is a real threat to the United States, even though, again, Russia doesn't have, the second biggest GDP. They don't have the second largest population. They have a lot of nuclear weapons, but, that's just about the only unique thing that makes Russia any kind of threat. I will also say the kind of disappointment I have with the sanctions bill is, that they talk about passing sanctions that make it harder for Donald Trump to lift sanctions against certain Russians. And, they didn't pass legislation to say that, hey, Donald Trump can't put sanctions back on Iran, after they were lifted under the, Iran nuclear agreement under Obama, because Iran is, still following the nuclear deal. And it kind of just goes to show that the Congress isn't interested in diplomacy. They're not interested in trying to keep the peace or stop Trump in any way when he's acting like a hawk. But if he even so much as, decides to talk to Vladimir Putin, then he's obviously a Russian stooge, and the Congress has to take steps to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't give our country over to the Russians. Last point real quick on the sanctions, and that would just be if, certain sanctions were placed against people, and then those people took important positions of power in Russia, and for that reason, Donald Trump wanted to lift those sanctions in order to let that person travel to the United States or somewhere else, or, just as a kind of a goodwill measure that, we're going to relieve sanctions on these certain officials. That really needs to be something that the president has the flexibility to do. And I think this probably, undercuts, Trump's policy as he tries to move forward with Russia quite a bit. The last thing I'll mention here, and something I've already talked about on the show, I believe 225 with Will Porter, and that is the, NDAA has a part in there that says that Donald Trump really can't cut the troop level in South Korea. Very disappointing because, look, if North Korea starts rapidly denuclearizing, not that I'm saying that's particularly likely, but Donald Trump should have the immediate flexibility to reduce U.S. troops in South Korea to whatever level he needs to help North Korea to feel comfortable giving up their nuclear weapons. And again, very unfortunate that Congress has taken this step. All right, the Saudi-Canada stuff. Very kind of crazy story that you really didn't expect. I've never heard that Saudi Arabia had particularly difficult relations with Canada, as compared to other nations, especially other Western nations. But a Canadian official criticized Saudi Arabia's human rights record, and I believe demanded that Saudi Arabia release somebody who is definitely a human rights activist held prisoner, and, is more or less a political prisoner in Saudi Arabia. Something that the Saudis have a lot of. They police a lot of, what they would call like sin crimes or something like that. Nonviolent crimes, things that don't really hurt anyone. Their laws are extremely restrictive of the rights of women, and there's plenty of reasons for humanitarian activists in Saudi Arabia to demand and speak out against the government there. But a lot of times they're unable to do so because of the oppression they face by the Saudi government. I'm guessing that Saudi jails, and I've read that Saudi jails are not places that you would ever want to be. And so, not that I think Canada should direct business on the Arabian Peninsula, but it's not wrong for the Canadians to speak out and to say what's going on in Saudi Arabia is unacceptable. Saudi Arabia responded with, I think, kind of like bringing a rocket launcher to a knife fight kind of tactics here, and saying they're cutting diplomatic relations with Canada, kicking the Canadian ambassador out of the country. They give him 24 hours to leave town, and recalling their ambassador from Canada. So, kind of seems like going from 0 to 100 there as far as it goes from the Saudis, and there should have been, I would assume, even if they, really had a problem with the Canadians said, deal with it at the UN or something like that. But really, it seemed to immediately go for cutting the relations between the two countries. As I have observed, the foreign policy and international relations and kind of world news, it's not often that I read stories that unfold quite like this one. So it definitely seems to be shocking. And then the next step I thought was very peculiar as well, and that is Saudi Arabia announced they would be looking at alternative placements for their students in Canada, and I think there's about 7,000 of those. So, there may be quite a bit more news to come out on this story, and I'm sure it's going to have interesting twists. But another very interesting part of this story, and I'm going to make sure I link to this on the show notes page so all of you could look at the actual tweet, because it is quite unbelievable. And that is a Saudi government Twitter account, and it was at infographic_KSA was the name of the Twitter account, which has since been deleted. However, plenty of people have the screenshots, and it shows they posted a picture of a airliner flying over, I believe, Toronto, and it says, "He who interferes with what doesn't concern him finds what doesn't please him." And so, at least a vague threat here, if not more or less a direct threat. And obviously the airliner reference, I believe it was 14 or 15 of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudis. And so, certainly you could get the message that Saudi Arabia was vaguely threatening Canada with hijacking one of their airplanes and flying it into one of their skyscrapers. Now, I don't know if, we could say that the Saudi government is making this threat or Mohammed bin Salman was behind this particular tweet. And it could even be that, there's dissenting factions in Saudi Arabia and somebody is looking to get Mohammed bin Salman in trouble here or something like that. Like I said, I'm still trying to piece this story together, and I'm sure I'll have updates for you on the coming shows as to really what's going on in Saudi Arabia with this relationship, because all these moves seem kind of out of hand. Another possible explanation, it doesn't seem right, but who knows, and that is on Sunday, which I think is the same day that this tweet came out and this whole business with Canada unfolded. You had a story come out in the AP about the Saudi coalition fighting in Yemen, giving support and aid to AQAP, which is Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula and often considered the most dangerous terror organization in the world as far as it comes to launching attacks against the United States. Now, as I've talked about on the show plenty of times, AQAP is somewhat not the, main player in the Yemeni civil war. On one side of that war, you have the Houthis, and on the other side, you have the Saudi-led coalition. They say they're trying to restore the internationally recognized President Hadi to the throne in the capital city of Sana'a, even though this seems very unlikely. However, there's not much of a Yemeni force fighting for Hadi, so that force is mainly made up of mercenaries and fighters paid by the Saudis and the Emiratis. And then they, typically operate with heavy air war power, bombs dropped by, again, the Saudis and the Emiratis. However, AQAP is a long-standing enemy of the Houthis, and I've talked about in the past on the show that the fight Saudi Arabia is waging against the Houthis is, at least an indirect consequence, helping AQAP, just because if you're fighting somebody's enemy, you're helping them. And that's just kind of the way it goes. And of course, you could say, well, that's not a reason not to fight against the Houthis. However, AQAP being the most, dangerous terror group in the world and being able to hold territory in Yemen, take ground, make millions of dollars should be a real problem for U.S. counterterrorism efforts. However, this, AP story really highlights how the Saudi coalition has done things like allow Al-Qaeda fighters into the ranks of their militias, and I'm sure they receive a salary there. They've allowed AQAP to retreat and get cover from, or I guess not get cover, but not, be bombed by United States, either airstrikes or drones. They've paid some people to, kind of go away and retreat. They've allowed them to retreat with their arms and money, at times, talking about $100 million or more. And so we could see how this war has really benefited AQAP, and at times directly at the hands of the Saudi-led coalition. Now, part of the Saudi-led coalition is the all-critical backing of the United States by providing Saudi Arabia with the bombs it needs, the maintenance on its airplanes, the assistance enforcing the naval blockade, and most importantly, the mid-air refueling the United States provides to Saudi Arabia, and then the intelligence assistance picking targets. And so by the United States backing this category, this coalition, it seems pretty clear that we're picking, to fight a war that's going to help AQAP in order to take on the Houthis. Now, the war hasn't disempowered the Houthis whatsoever, and seems to have only increased their power and reach and influence in Yemen. Certainly, I'm sure turning a lot of people against the Hadi government, just because that Hadi government is backed by a coalition that's raining bombs down on them and indiscriminately hitting civilian targets. I mean, all the proof is there now that Saudi Arabia is just dropping the bombs at random, letting them fall where they may, and if that's on the houses of innocent civilians, or on hospitals, or on schools, or on water treatment facilities, then that's just what it is. But the United States is making the choice that it's more important for us to fight the Houthis than to go and fight against AQAP, and by, fighting against the Houthis, we're assisting AQAP. Now, I'm not going to say that, the United States people have really an enemy overseas that we constantly need to fight against, and fighting against groups and fighting counterinsurgencies and trying to implement coin policies do not work. However, if there are people in the world that actually want to come to America and kill Americans, those are the jihadist, Sunni, Osama bin Laden type terrorists, and that's who AQAP is. The Houthis are not Al-Qaeda. They're not even Hezbollah. They're barely backed by Iran whatsoever. And yet this rebel group, the United States is picking to fight a war against at the benefit and aid of Al-Qaeda. And so this is just the most insane policy. I think to this day, there are a lot of stupid policies of the United States government. I'm sure I'm going to read an article later that makes me say it about something else. But the war in Yemen has to be the most counterproductive thing the United States government is doing right now, and the most detrimental. I mean, it's getting to the point in Yemen where this is really becoming a genocide against the people of Yemen. The starving has to be considered intentional. The bombing is definitely indiscriminate at best, at worst intentionally targeting civilian infrastructure and just terrorizing the population. I think that's about all I have. Just remember, if you look at it and really think about who is your enemy, who are you willing, are really believing that is going to come up, show up in the United States and start killing Americans, it's really not Russians and it's really not the Houthis or even the Iranians. The only people you can really pinpoint and think of are, of course, the, Osama bin Laden type terrorists, and those are limited in number and would be more limited in number if we wouldn't do things like, bomb entire countries trying to kill a couple. All right, that's where I'll wrap up today's show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or libertarianinstitute.org to share the show. Facebook, check out the private Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus, on Twitter at KYAAALE. And then for those of you who really want to help out, patreon.com/Foreign Policy Focus. Donate to the show there. I really appreciate it when you guys do that. And hopefully I got some bonus content recorded. I really need to put it up. My apologies, of course, to Pat McFarlane, who did that bonus content with me, them neglecting to post, but it was good stuff, and I think you all enjoy it. So, subscribe and rate the show on iTunes and Stitcher too. Thanks, everyone.